Will China use the coronavirus outbreak to take over power in the world? Well, we'll be answering that question with Senator Cotton later on today. But first of all, steady progress. That's the president's assessment of where America stands in the battle against what he calls the beast. And what about China's role in the pandemic? Will the Chinese be held accountable? We've got Arizona Senator Tom Cotton with us and his take on this hot-button issue. But first, here's Gary Lane.
With the $350 billion in funds set aside for small businesses now depleted, President Trump said over the weekend that his administration and members of Congress are close to reaching a deal to provide as much as $400 billion in additional relief.
We're continuing to negotiate with the Democrats to get our great workers and small businesses all over the country taken care of. I think we're getting close to a deal. Could happen. Could happen. A lot of good work has been going on.
Final negotiations underway as a U.S. Chamber of Commerce poll finds that 1 in 10 businesses say they're less than 1 month away from closing permanently. And on the jobless front, 22 million Americans have filed for unemployment within the past 4 weeks. Some states like Texas, South Carolina, and Florida are starting slowly to open back up. People flocked to the beaches in Jacksonville over the weekend. Economist Stephen Moore, a member of President Trump's task force to reopen the economy, said he expects a gradual process with western and midwestern states opening first, then East Coast states. But he's optimistic about the weeks ahead.
I really do think things are really looking brighter now every day, and now I'm thinking in a month's time or so we could really see the American economy up and running again.
With the nationwide shutdown now entering its 6th week, protesters hit the streets in state capitals over the weekend in Colorado and Washington state, demanding to get back to their jobs and businesses. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says there's an urgency to provide more relief for hospitals, firefighters, teachers, and small businesses.
Let's get as much as we can for those who are helping to fight this fight so that we can soon open our economy.
And now a growing number of Americans are laying blame on China. In early February, biologist James Lyons-Weiler told CBN News his research found the Chinese were working on the virus as early as 2005. He thinks the pandemic began as a laboratory infection.
It's possible that the Chinese scientists were trying to jump on the global market for a coronavirus vaccine, which would be huge because it's a cold virus.
Appearing on the CBN News program Faith Nation, author Gordon Chang agrees with the theory that the virus may have come from a biolab accident in Wuhan.
In terms of motivation, this is a really important question because even though this was an accidental release, Beijing had malign motives. Because, as I mentioned, they knew about the human-to-human transmissibility of this. They knew, and they urged countries to accept travelers from China.
President Trump says China may be held accountable.
If it was a mistake is a mistake. But if they were knowingly responsible, yeah, then there should be consequences.
On Capitol Hill, Senator Tom Cotton is among members of Congress who believe China is responsible for the viral pandemic and should be held accountable. The Arkansas senator began warning of the coronavirus and Chinese disinformation back in January. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thanks, Gary. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas sounded the alarm about the threat of the coronavirus long before others. He joins us now to talk about our economy and China's role in all this. Senator, you said China should be held responsible for every death and job lost in the pandemic. Why do you say that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that China is culpable for unleashing this pandemic on the world. First off, as you just reported, all the evidence, circumstantial to be sure, but all the evidence right now points to these laboratories in Wuhan as the most likely source for this virus. Perhaps it was an accidental breach that resulted from Chinese incompetence, but still, they knew the risks, they knew the shortcomings in those labs. But even worse, by late December, early January, once it became clear to the Chinese Communist Party leaders that this virus was highly contagious and deadly and was being transmitted from humans to humans, they continued to encourage travel outside of of China to the rest of the world. I believe that was a deliberate decision that was designed to seed cases around the world so China wouldn't be the only nation that suffered a relative decline of its power. That's why I think China is culpable for this pandemic and why there has to be consequences for them.
Senator, that's an awful charge. Do you realize how horrible it would be? I mean, that thing has destroyed the world. I mean, people are going to be suffering. They're starving. There's this pandemic all over the world, and people, the food supply is being compromised. I mean, to think the Chinese did that deliberately?
Xi Jinping and the communist leadership in Beijing would think of nothing at the deaths of hundreds of thousands or even millions of foreign nationals if it meant preserving Chinese power. Let's keep in mind that they currently have more than 1 million religious minorities interned in gulag re-education camps. They force women to have abortions. They harvest organs from political prisoners. And of course, their communist forebears in the Chinese Communist Party, going back to the 1940s, are responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of their own people. Those kinds of people would think of nothing of putting this virus outside of China's borders if that's what it took to maintain China's relative power in the world.
Senator, you know, up in the South China Sea, they're building islands and claiming it's part of China. Do you think we're going to look at a military confrontation with them sometime in the not too distant future?
No, China doesn't want a military confrontation with us, and of course we should never seek military confrontation with any nation. We should try to resolve our differences, and if we can't, achieve our interests in other ways. That's one reason why, for instance, I've said that we need to build up a military that's capable of deterring Chinese aggression in the South China Sea or against our allies, why we need to bring back more manufacturing capacity from China back to the United States, why we need to open America's courts to lawsuits by those who have suffered from this virus against Chinese leaders. There's many other steps that we can take to ensure that China pays the consequences for its misdeeds, well short of any kind of military confrontation.
Well, now, I understand that they really have been supplying a large part of our medicine, our drugs, and they are holding us hostage. They could cut off the supply, and especially of these critical materials, and do us terrible damage.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case, and it's a terrible situation that our leaders in Washington have allowed to develop over the last 30 years. So in the short run, we are dependent on China for basic drugs like ibuprofen or acetaminophen and a lot of the protective equipment that our great doctors and nurses need, like masks or gowns. And China is, in fact, blocking the export of those products to the United States right now. But in the near term, in the months and the years ahead, we cannot allow that situation to continue. That's why we have to bring manufacturing capacity for those critical goods, not just for national defense, but for our public health and safety, out of China and back to the United States.
Are they sending corrupt stuff like fentanyl to us, too? I mean, it looks like that's where the source of that mess is coming from.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is just another act of Chinese perfidy. So they intentionally overproduce fentanyl, which does have legitimate pain management purposes, but then they send that surplus fentanyl to Mexico, and the cartels use it to lace their drugs, which they then bring into the United States to poison our own people. And we're losing 70,000 people a year from drug overdoses, especially overdoses laced with fentanyl. Ultimately, that goes back to China. That's why I've proposed legislation in the past that would impose sanctions on Chinese officials who are responsible for sending that fentanyl into our streets.
Listen, are those sanctions going to work, or has there got to be something a little bit more robust to take charge of it? This is terrible what you're talking about. I mean, it's really an act of aggression of the worst sort.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party, like communists everywhere and always, do not value human life. They do not care about freedom. They will do anything to stay in power, and that includes those kinds of aggressive actions against the United States to destabilize our society, to sicken our people, to achieve their goals of increasing their power relative to ours. That's why there's so many steps we have to take to ensure that China doesn't achieve that objective.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. This is an alarming report, but ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate Senator Cotton and this rather bold statement that he's made. Well, in other news, President Trump sent a message to certain states where he believes governors have imposed too much control during this crisis. And he had a special warning for the people of Virginia. John Jessup has more on that.
That's right, Pat. President Trump singled out Virginia Democrats, particularly Governor Ralph Northam, over the state's recent actions, including a new gun control measure, tweeting, "Liberate Virginia and save your great Second Amendment. It's under siege." This after Governor Northam reinstated a limit of purchasing one handgun per month. That's just one of the many laws the Democratic governor recently signed. Another one prohibits discrimination based on gender identity, regardless of the person's sex at birth. The law could force high school girls to compete against biological males in sports, and it allows no exemption for religious groups or people of faith, meaning a Christian baker could be sued for refusing to bake a cake for celebrating a gender transition. Pat?
I want you to know at Regent University, people appeared at the hearing, and they just had no standing. The Democrats control the Virginia legislature, and it is just awful. This bill has no religious exemption whatsoever, and therefore, if there's any particular charge against a university or a business because of so-called LGBTQ issues, that particular institution can be held responsible regardless of their religious faith. So the people are talking about, well, there's got to be some kind of a declaratory judgment because this violates the federal Constitution. So it's a major religious freedom issue. John?
Pat, continuing on the issue of religious freedom, a federal judge blocked a Kansas order limiting in-person attendance at religious services to 10 people or less. Governor Laura Kelly issued the order to enforce social distancing guidelines. Apparently, the judge believes that might be a violation of the First Amendment. In his decision, U.S. District Judge John Brooms wrote, "Churches and religious activities appear to have been singled out among essential functions for stricter treatment." The judge's ruling will remain in effect until May 2nd. The state's stay-at-home order is set to expire the next day. Well, severe thunderstorms pounded parts of the Deep South Sunday with hail, high winds, and drenching rains. Emergency crews in Mississippi rescued drivers trapped in floodwaters. Some roads in Alabama were impassable after heavy rains. Tornadoes were a possible threat across parts of those states, as well as Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina. And the National Weather Service said Sunday some areas were under a flash flood warning. It was, Pat, the second Sunday in a row that the South was pounded with severe weather.
Well, it's one of those strange things, but it's like everything's conspiring against this nation right now. And these tornadoes have been devastating, and they're going all the way up, and now torrential rains, roads being closed. And
lots of wind in this area.
Well, terrible. I mean, power outages continuous, and more coming.
We need prayer.
We do indeed. All right.
We do.